Welcome everyone to the 20th Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Bedigal Nation, and Charles Darwin University, as the hosts of this lecture, has a footprint on the lands of many nations within the Northern Territory, its interstate campuses and globally. I therefore respectfully acknowledge all First Nations people. The Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture Series was established in 1996 by the then Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation and was delivered at the Northern Territory University, which later became what we know today as Charles Darwin University. Charles Darwin University became the sole custodians of the lecture in 2007. This lecture commemorates the landmark Wave Hill Station walk-off, led by Vincent Lingiari on the 23rd of August 1966. And each year we honour the activism of Mr Lingiari, the 200 Gurindji workers and their families, and their 8-year-long struggle for land rights that inspired national change. Charles Darwin University acknowledge Indigenous peoples are the first educators and the first innovators, and that their knowledge can make an important contribution to the improvement of local, national and global communities. CDU deeply engages with and is informed by the Indigenous peoples of Australia and the unique perspectives they bring. In this regard, CDU is extremely honoured to be the host of this significant lecture series, which gives voice to Aboriginal advocacy issues and has become part of the Gurindji Freedom Day festival that annually commemorates the Wave Hill walk-off. It is now my special privilege to introduce Dr. Sue Stanton, who, as a Gurindji descendant, will deliver a short address on behalf of Vincent Lingiari's descendants. Dr. Stanton is Elder Executive Advisor, Academic and Cultural Leadership at Batchelor Institute, and has been the cultural consultant for these lectures.
I thank Charles Darwin University for providing me with the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of Gurindji descendants, especially those of us who are living far distant from our Gurindji heartland. I speak as one descendant of the many members of Gurindji Nation, conscious that I am only one in the wide diaspora of Gurindji people spread throughout Australia. I especially pay homage to Gurindji family who, through their generosity of spirit, without judgment, without prejudice, continue to share their wisdom, their knowledge and their fighting spirit with all those listening this evening. I stand proud tonight as I acknowledge those Gurindji grandfathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins who represented us in the first big land rights battle at Wave Hill. My personal tribute is to the dedication to my Gurindji grandmother, Violet Polly Wakelin McGuinness, taken from Gurindji country when only a child and incarcerated at Carlin Compound, Darwin, all those years ago. My grandmother would be proud of the Gurindji and other peoples of the district, women, men and children who walked off Wave Hill Station years ago. She would have been proud, as I am, that our Gurindji family walked away from harsh and cruel conditions and demanded that Gurindji be given back our land. I acknowledge all the spirit and the hard work of those Gurindji families who remain solid in their identity, those that help us all to keep the spirit of the old man Vincent and all the Gurindji warriors, all the Mudbara mob, all the different contributors and freedom fighters of the days that culminated in the historical 1966 movement at Wave Hill. It seems that it is time again to speak of breaking free from the shackles of colonialism, to stand up and to be strong and to be loud, to remind all of the strong fighting spirit of Gurindji people. We will fight, and we will fight again. We will never lose the pride in our hearts. Gurindji people will survive in their land and away from it. Our spirit will never be destroyed. Let us keep working at breaking free. May Gurindji spirit and voice keep you strong. Mandach for now. Thank you.
For over 20 years, the lecture series has hosted high-profile keynote speakers, including the Honourable Golf Whitlam, Dr. G. Yunupingu, the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, Professor Larissa Berendt, and respected Aboriginal leader Pat Anderson, and many others, including two of our panellists here today. Now, in its 20th iteration for the year 2020, the Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture sees us in global pandemic conditions to offer a new digital format and a discussion panel to honour and celebrate the legacy of this nationally significant commemoration. Today, we have invited two previous keynote speakers, Senator Patrick Dodson, current Senator for Western Australia, who served as the inaugural chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, and Professor Marcia Langton, Associate Provost, Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, who in 1995 was Ranger Professor of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies at CDU. Together, they played a significant role in bringing this memorial lecture series to fruition. Joining them today will be Bruce Pascoe, highly acclaimed author of Dark Emu. He compellingly argues for the reconsideration of the hunter-gatherer label for pre-colonial Aboriginal Australians. The adapted work that turned into Young Dark Emu now brings an alternate, more accurate history of Indigenous culture and agriculture to a younger audience. Most recently, he was appointed Enterprise Professor in Indigenous Agriculture at the University of Melbourne. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, John. I'm speaking to you from Narm, Wurundjeri country, so I pay my respects to the traditional owners and their elders, past and present, and also to the traditional owners of Darwin, the Warrakia people, where this oration was born, and of course to their elders past and present, and to the Gurindji traditional owners and their elders past and present. So in 1966, I was in high school, but the struggle of the Gurindji had started to appear in the media. And by 1969, I was very much aware of it because I organised a land rights demonstration in the centre of Brisbane and put a mining tenement over the park between the old Lands Department and another grand old public service building, which is now the casino, and managed to get a lot of media attention for the Gurindji and for everybody else who was very interested in the idea of land rights that they had raised. And so that was covered in the Australian, and people now and again send me photos of that old demonstration in 1969. I remember even my grandmother turned up. So, one of the things about that period in the 60s was that it was very soon after the referendum, the 1967 referendum, and many of our elders had been campaigning for a change in the Constitution to remove the racism, and they believed that they were campaigning for Aboriginal equality. And many of them, of course, were very concerned with land rights and other matters as well. And as everybody knows now, they were successful. In 1967, they managed to convince Australians to vote overwhelmingly in the affirmative for two changes to the Constitution. One, to remove the prohibition on the Parliament making laws for us, and the other to remove the prohibition on us being counted in the census. And during their very long campaign, which went on for more than 10 years, all of the issues that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were concerned with, especially as members of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, raised all of these issues in a series of pamphlets at their annual conferences and so on. And so there was, at least among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, a very deep awareness of these problems. Of course, by that time, Koiki Mabo had joined for Katsy, He was like, Joe McGuinness, the famous president of FACATSI, and other senior members of FACATSI. He'd had experience working on the wharves in Townsville. Many of our Aboriginal members and Torres Strait Islander members had worked on the wharves in North Queensland, and were joined in the campaign by unionists from the old Maritime Union, as it was back then, and various other unions. And very soon after the Gurindji campaign in 1970, the Tent Embassy was set up in Canberra. So the influence of Vincent Lingiari and his fellow elders of the Gurindji people was profound. It reached Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people right across the country.
Thanks, Marcia. Senator Dodson, what's your memories of the walk-off and the movement towards equality in the late 60s and early 70s?
Thank you, and I too acknowledge the Gurindji people. I was a young boy growing up in Katherine in the Northern Territory, and I'd some time before had gone out to work at one of the stations, Willaroo Station, which wasn't far from the town of Katherine. So I understood a lot of the living conditions that Aboriginal people had in the sort of authoritarian ways in which the pastoralists dealt with people, the camps that people lived in, the segregation and the lack of proper wages that were not being paid. And so as a young man, I observed the conditions in the pastoral world, and the poor pay, the poor conditions, and the absolute form of slavery that existed. I then went off to secondary school in Western Victoria, and the Gurindji, of course, went on strike I was about the mid-term of secondary school, and I'd come back for holidays, and there was a meeting in the Katherine Town Hall called the Rights for Whites. And it was a terrible thing because people had been bussed up from Adelaide and other places, white folks, and a few Aboriginal people from I don't know where, but they came to basically condemn the strikers and condemn the Gurindji for upsetting the social order and for demanding better conditions, better wages, and certainly starting to demand that their land be returned to them. So Vincent and the Gurindji had a very profound impact upon me as a young man. And then to see the challenges basically unroll, because to get to Wave Hill, you got to go through Katherine. And anything that was happening through that sort of prism. But to see Vincent and others fly off to meetings, as Marcia has mentioned, the town hall meetings, trade unionists had organised, churches, to basically send his message, very simple message, that they wanted their land back and that it belonged to them. You got to remember, this was Lord Vestey, and Vestey had held a lot of properties across Northern Australia at the time, and the working conditions were appalling. The treatment of women was appalling. The living conditions that people had were absolutely appalling. There was no real defence or advocacy for people, except at the early stages when Robert Tutawali, who was a famous actor, got involved, and Dexter Daniels got involved as part of the union movement. And I think there was some connection with what had happened in the West at the protests in Western Australia some years before, of people from the pastoral, living on pastoral property, were basically indentured. And so the slavery of people, the absolute control and domination of the pastoral manager, over people's lives, and the lack of any defence. There weren't legal services around, there weren't communication systems like we have today, but we all had to rely on the ABC or rely on some form of communication. And I think Vincent was a great advocate in getting the message across, which brings together all of those things that Marcia has spoken about, the Fakatsi movement, Tent Embassy, the whole concept of racism in Australia. But it also highlighted this challenge of how does the government recognise rights for Aboriginal people to land? And they had no idea how to do that. They talked about leases and licenses and easements, but they never talked about freehold being given to Aboriginal people. There was no such idea of native title at the time. And so the centrality to people's justice was getting land back under some kind of legislation. And I think that then led to a common mantra across Australia. When people marched, there was often this common mantra that, what do you want? You know, land rights, when do you want it now? And that was the focal point around many things when we marched about, protested, whatever it was. So I think the focus of land, the need to be in control of your own destiny, and the seeking of returns through your own management, I think were what Vincent started to throw up. But it was in the days when education wasn't that readily available to many people, of our people, where communication was poor, and the organisations that were strong were the unions or churches, and as the growth of Fakatsi and other entities started to form, and gradually the organisations came into existence, I think. But Vincent's legacy was very much one of steadfastness, stay focused, don't sell out, because you got to remember that the government created a community associated with Waddy Creek, Dargaragu, and tried to entice the people from where they camped into this welfare settlement in order to break the protest and to get people to go back to work for the pastoralists. So the divide and rule tactics also were very clear, and the method of that was very clear. So those tactics by government to break the back of protest began to emerge very early. And Unlucky Australians, I think there was a book written by a communist guy, Frank Hardy, which again helped people get a bit of an understanding of how the plight of Aboriginal people had become so dominated by these wealthy and influential pastoralists like Vesti.
Pat, I might bring Bruce Pascoe into the conversation there. You're talking about, education of our people, but Bruce, for generations, non-Indigenous people were not taught the true history of this country. And in fact, many white Australians had little or no contact with Aboriginal people. So the protest movement, the strike at Wave Hill, took over 8 years. Do you think that it took so long because people were robbed of the history? They didn't understand the connection between land and Aboriginal people, and the way that Vincent was doing it with town hall meetings with the unions was really educating a generation of people who had never really been educated about Indigenous land or our connection to land or culture before the 1960s.
Yeah, the whole education system was biased against Aboriginal people because it was insisting on the incompetence of Aboriginal people. And when I first went to school, we were still learning about, heads being measured and things like that, which is an indication of what the mainstream thought of Aboriginal people. But in '66, I was still at school, my uncle was talking to me about not only my own family, but he was a unionist, so he was talking to me about some of the key facts. By 1969, he'd taken me down to Malakuta to work on his trucks. And I was learning more about my own country, but by strangely enough, I was reading Frank Hardy while I was at school and at university. Later on, I was publishing Frank Hardy, and he told me a lot about the walk-off. So I was learning it through unionism more than my own people, apart from Uncle. But Frank often talked about Vincent as one of the great people of Australia. So he was a visionary in many ways. He recognised that Vincent had an idea about what Australia was, which was in complete contrast in style and depth to how Australia was seeing itself as, born in the image of Donald Bradman and, our great invention, the stump jump plough and gold, sheep and wool, that sort of thing. And so what Frank admired about Vincent was not just that he could conceive of a different Australia, he was insisting that there would be a different Australia in relation to his own people. So my experience of that era was, through other people, and but I wish that Frank Hardy and Vincent Lingiari had met my uncle, because they could have educated him too, and as a consequence, my education would have been a lot better. But this is a long process. We're talking about Charlie Perkins as well, and before them, William Cooper. There's a huge tradition of this activism. Marcia at the tent embassy, and it's not over, and it will not going to be over for a long time, because every time we think we've reached a benchmark, there's an intervention or there is a closing the gap idea. But we are making incredible progress, but there's so much further to go.
Yeah, and Bruce, of course, it's activism that is really challenging the narrative of this country, isn't it? Marcia, I might come to you. The Wave Hill Walk-Off took over 8 years. Why do you think it took so long to get change for the Gurindji people?
Well, first of all, they were virtually slaves. So, I really want to make that point. There are very pedantic historians who'd rather call them indentured labour. But, when you look at the reality of it, they were slaves. Often they didn't get paid in cash. They were paid in, tobacco and tea and so on. And they, and Patrick might know more about that than me. But I did meet Vincent in Sydney one time, and I had a really wonderful discussion with him. He was the sweetest person. He had the most beautiful voice. And I gather, and I also met Frank Hardy, and a few of the unionists who actually went there to support them. So first of all, you have to understand that it's a very remote place, especially back then. There were no telecommunications, highways. People had to get out of there by driving on, a very great distance, dirt roads, very slow. And there were some unionists in Darwin who managed to organise, other unionists to come and support them. And I think it was the fourth or fifth lecture was given by Brian Manning, who was one of those unionists, one of the fourth or fifth Lingiari Memorial orations. And there was another bloke who lived in Darwin, Paddy someone, I'm trying to remember his name. Fantastic. Paddy Carroll. Yeah. Paddy Carroll. So they were fabulous at, getting the leaders, especially Vincent, who was such a great advocate, in touch with contacts around Australia who organised meetings in support of them. And it wasn't just unionists. it was, as Senator Dodson said, also church people and also socialites. There were for some reason, I don't understand why, I don't know the full history of it, but there were socialites in Sydney who were so impressed with Vincent and the struggle of the Gurindji that they held events in Sydney as well. In the cities, Vincent and the Gurindji people became quite a cause célèbre. And just to correct Bruce, I wasn't at the Tent Embassy. I was never at the Tent Embassy, but I just mentioned it because there's no doubt that all of the people who did go to the Tent Embassy were inspired by Vincent. Now, also remember, and I don't know, but maybe there was one phone that they had access to. Maybe they had no access to phones. You know, and here's the thing. These strikes, by the way, started in about 1946 or 1947 at the end of World War II, when the Aboriginal people who had gone off to serve, whether in a military or non-combatant role, were demobbed, went back to the stations, and the experience during World War II contrasted so sharply with everything that had gone before it. When they came back, they started to organise. And this particularly happened over there in the Pilbara with the Jigalong mob and others. There was quite an amazing campaign that developed in the 1940s there. And they began, I'm not sure what it's called, panning for tin and gold and so on, gold I think mainly, and they took their gold down to the assay office. They saved up £25,000 and bought their first station. And I think the old unionist name there who helped them was Don McLeod.
Yeah.
And some of the men who'd come back from non-combatant roles had been paid equal wages by the Defence Forces. They go back to the stations and they're back on $1 a week if they're lucky, usually, tea, flour, sugar, jerky or dried bullocky, and they realised, hello, the rest of the world gets paid wages. And so they went on strike, and those strikes continued right across North Australia for decades afterwards. I remember going to the Territory in the 70s on a bus, and I met my first Aboriginal person who was on strike. I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Duck River. I said, oh, yeah, what's happening? And he said, oh, we're on strike. So, the strikes were on many of the stations, right through to, over Borroloola way. And the Daniels family, they were the leaders of the strikes down that way. And all of this led up to a case before the Arbitration Commission for Equal Wages. One of the Daniels brothers was the leader in that litigation. And I think they were represented by the very same barrister, I'm trying to remember his name, Frank, who represented the Yolngu in their case in Millipum v. Nabalco. Well, they won the case and the Arbitration Commission ruled that Aboriginal people should be paid equal wages. And then the pastoralists said, we're not going to pay them equal wages, and threw everybody off the stations. And, it didn't happen all of a sudden, but it did happen. And over time, the stations, mechanised, and they, used helicopters and bikes and so on to muster. And the big long droves ended and they started using trucks. So it was a terrible period for Aboriginal people, and everywhere in every jurisdiction there was a form of apartheid. And I think it's too shallow to just call it racial discrimination. There was formal separation. So I grew up in Queensland under that kind of legislation. We were all, whether we knew it or not, wards of the state for a number of years. As a child, I lived on what was called a native camp. It was a designated native camp. But most Aboriginal people lived on reserves where as my grandfather had, and his twin brother, and their lives were absolutely regulated as wards of the state. And this was the case in the Northern Territory as well, where people were classified as indentured labour under the Welfare Ordinance. But, you know, what happened was up to the station owners, and the vesties were famous for their cruelty and their, you know, neglect of their workers. People were literally starving, as I heard it. Yeah. So that's just, you know, my recollection of those times and what they went through. But it was because of the campaigners, the unionists, the church people, some of them lawyers, you know, socialites. One of the old unionists was an electrician and went up to help them set up generators. Some teachers drove up and volunteered. So it became quite the cause célèbre amongst those people who began to understand the terrible conditions that they live in. And I'm grateful to Bruce for raising Frank Hardy, because Frank Hardy's book inspired people, and I think that had an enormous influence on getting people to support them. And also there were television programs on the ABC.
Yeah.
Also inspired people.
Yeah, I think the ABC material was instrumental in getting it into the homes of every Australian. Pat, I might come to you, and looking now over the last 20 years to today, how do you think today's activism honours the legacy of Vincent Lingiari and the Gurindji walk-off?
Sometimes it's a bit hard to fit because of different periods and different sorts of resources available to people who advocate and protest. But I think standing up for justice and having a vision of what you want to achieve for not only yourself but for the people really is where the honour goes. And Bruce made a very important comment about Vincent having an idea of what Australia should be or could be, and he was determined to try to make it that. And I think that's where the commonality is in the protest movements, whether it's about deaths in custody, whether it's about domestic violence, whether it's about Black Lives Matter, or whether it's about a voice, whatever, it's about, at the centre of it, a different Australia that accommodates the aspirations and the needs of First Nations peoples in a respectful manner, and allows that to prosper without constantly trying to subjugate it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the commonality in it, that Vincent sought to become independent of Vesti and of government. He had a little herd that he wanted to turn into a commercial operation. He had aspirations to live as a free man, yet again, as his forefathers had lived, free of the encumbrances and the slavery that Marcia has mentioned. And I think that's the commonality here in the protesters today, and the movements today are really about trying to break these shackles that constantly try to make us conform and to submit and to be shaped to the ends that the mainstream society demands. I mean, we have so many. I've just been doing an inquiry into the Jugan Caves as part of the Parliament, and the fact that a state government can give a licence to a mining company that makes it absolutely sacrosanct that they can destroy a site without any protest is part of this different society we want to see. We don't want to see that kind of society. We want to see one where there's justice, respect, and the upholding of our sacred heritages and our unique ways of living and our ways of thinking and believing. And we want to be part of a modern world, but we don't want to constantly be, controlled. Like there's a bill that's coming into the Senate that's going to put 27,000 Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory compulsorily under income management, under the cashless debit card. Now, the difference, I think, with the protests of the past and the one of today is that we don't find the agitation to protest against those particular things that governments are doing to us in the manner that they do it. Whereas in the past, people would have been very astute to the impacts of what government's legislation or policy was doing to them, and then there'd be a protest call go up, and the solidarity across the nation would start to ferment, and people would gather to protest about that particular injustice. We tend to be a bit cause-driven, and we tend to be a bit haphazard, I think, today in terms of picking up an issue, making a couple of splashes in the headlines, and then it dissipates. Yeah. Whereas these battles of the past were really about the achievement of the longer-term goal, but on an incremental basis, and to make sure you kept at it until you got somewhere that was better than where we'd been. So Vincent, I think, highlights the tenacity that also went with his advocacy and his astuteness to know how to leverage his capacity in a way to get the outcomes that he was about. I think Marcia was at the Central Land Council when we went to Waddy Creek. It was one of the last titles, I think, that we gave back to the Gurindji people, or that was given back to the Gurindji people as a form of inalienable freehold under the Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory. And the old man was pretty much done then. He was lying on a old foam mattress in the creek bed at Dagaragu. And that was the best form of title we could achieve under the Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory. It wasn't what Vincent had hoped for, but it was the best you could get. And at least it gave his people some sanctuary from the absolute atrocious behaviour that Vesties and his thugs meted out to the people. So the connection is making sure you keep focused on where you want to end up, and not just pick up a cause because it becomes topical and it's a 5 or 10 minute wonder on the media. These have been long-term struggles of the past, which have led to some of the better things, like the preparedness of some of the states now to talk about treaty, led to the Mabo judgment, which has led to the Native Title Act, has led to the peak organisation sitting at the table of the leaders of the states and the Commonwealth. They haven't delivered all the things we wanted, but at least the shift has taken place. And that's the question we've got to ask ourselves: is where do we want to be, and how do we want to be when we get there, rather than what's the cause we need to fight today because we know of an injustice that happened in the past.
Pat, I want to take you back to the 90s, and of course, one of the big movements of the 90s was in fact the movement towards reconciliation. And in 2000 we had hundreds of thousands of people walking across Sydney Harbour Bridge to support finishing the unfinished business of this country. I think was sort of the catch cry around the 90s. Are you frustrated that 20 years on from that historic bridge walk and the people's real movement towards finishing the unfinished business of this country, that we're still arguing and debating and talking about the same issues or the same level of progress?
I'm very, very frustrated about that. We're on the brink of seriously starting to just get the frameworks together, I think, for serious treaty discussions. There was a piece of legislation, I think, drafted by that last council that sought to put into a legislative framework a way to go about dealing with the unfinished business. Howard, of course, has got a lot to pay for this because he divided the movement into practical reconciliation and some sort of symbolic, as if it was symbolic to get away from the people that oppressed you, because you wanted land rights. So he was successful in convincing the mainstream and other Aboriginal groups, I think, that we needed to fix up the appalling social situations that we were in. And we do have to do that, there's no question. but you also have to deal with these legacy issues of dispossession, of the theft of the land, of the lack of treaty, the lack of compensation, and the lack of any real meaningful governance for First Nations peoples within the polity of this nationhood. So the legacy of Howard, I think, in coining the term practical reconciliation, is where we're at now, you know, and we think it's a big time to have the peaks sitting down with the governments. Well, you know, we did have ATSIC and we did have the NAC and we had some other entities that were really about trying to get the regional control over the delivery of services and the better outcomes. So we're still discussing program delivery rather than justice and the rights of the Aboriginal people.
Thanks, Pat. And Bruce, now 20 years on from that bridge walk, more Australians are reading more works like Dark Emu and lots of other Indigenous authors and non-Indigenous authors that are really recasting what they've been taught at school. How do you think that will play a part in when this generation and the next generation maybe have to vote on referendum or vote for treaties or support treaties? How do you think that the shift in what they've learnt about the true history of this country will shape their decisions and their interactions with our mob?
There's a different mood in the country now, and it's the result of many things. You know, it's people like Vincent, people like Charlie, people like all of those old people who resisted the oppression. But I'm concerned that enthusiasm is not going to be enough. I think people will vote differently. I think there's far more support for Aboriginal people now than there has been, but it makes me nervous because I'm wondering whether enthusiasm makes you more comfortable but not more active. And I became concerned about the enthusiasm, you know, for the Aboriginal grains and tubers that I was talking about in Dark Emu. And I realised that the uptake of these was not going to be in doubt. Restaurateurs and bakers were all over it like a bad suit. But I became alarmed because I thought, where in this enthusiasm do Aboriginal people sit? And the answer was nowhere. That the foods would be adopted. They may or may not be recognised as Aboriginal foods, but Aboriginal people weren't in the industry. Aboriginal people still had no land, still had no recognition of their history. So we started growing these grains ourselves. I bought an old rundown dairy farm, and we started growing these foods with local Yuin people because I was being approached all the time by big food companies who wanted a slice of the pie, but all they wanted was the rights. You know, it was like tick a black box. You know, I've consulted with Aboriginal people and therefore now we own it and we're going to run away with it. That was what alarmed me. So the farm in a way is like a little bit of insurrection to try and galvanise real change, that is Aboriginal employment and eventually Aboriginal land ownership, and true recognition that these plants that we're talking about are Aboriginal domesticates and they are ancient. This activity we know is at least 65,000 years old by a white and archaeological measure. So this is what we're trying to change, and I don't think you can rely on enthusiasm alone. It's great. It's the thing that provides the initial energy, but I think the result will depend on black action. It will depend on our communities insisting on their rights. And it's not about radicalism, because I think the true radicals are the people who blew up the cave. They're the true radicals. We are the conservatives, but we need our conservatives, our conservative communities, which are conservative because, our whole law is about care for Mother Earth, and that's the true conservation. the true conservatism. But we need our communities to say, we will get involved in this. And we want our elders in those communities to say, we want our children to be part of this. We don't want our children walking around the street in the middle of the day doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
We want our children to be part of this movement of bringing back Aboriginal rights in regard to our plants. And there's a huge industry going to develop around them. And we need to make sure that we're part of it. And because there are many, many big companies who don't care whether we're part of it or not, as long as they're making millions of dollars. And they will garner support, as a couple of big farming companies are doing right now, creaming all the research funding, creaming all the benevolent funding, because they're growing our plants, because they sequester carbon, and within months, on the advice of Boris Johnson and the new president of America, we will suddenly believe in climate change, and the way to affect it more quickly than anything else is to grow perennial plants.
Mm.
And we want to be involved in that. And there are communities around the country with land who are turning to those things themselves, and they need our support, because otherwise big food will take over and it will just be business as usual, and the Aboriginal history in these plants will be forgotten.
And in some way, you're right, going back to Vincent Lingiari and the walk-off, it's inserting his community and the Aboriginal community into that decision making. Marcia, I want to come to you. Of course, one of the big drivers of interest in Indigenous rights around the world, and especially black rights, was of course this year being the Black Lives Matter campaign. And it all started with the death of George Floyd early on in the year. Marcia, were you frustrated that it took the death of an American to highlight issues here in Australia that we know have been going on for generations? And in fact, we've had those similar incidents in Australia recently, and all the way back to the 80s, and some of those incidents that sparked the deaths in custody. I'm talking about John Pat in the 80s. We had those similar situations. Does it frustrate you, Marcia, that it took George Floyd's death to really make this country wake up in a sense?
It was very frustrating, and moreover, I would say that the country hasn't woken up. So just to give you an example of what I mean about the country not waking up to the toll that deaths in custody has on our people. Only one jurisdiction in Australia, the ACT, has legislated to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 years old. None of the other jurisdictions agreed to do that, from 10 years to 14 years. And when COAG was held, the Council of Australian Governments, the Western Australian Government's excuse for refusing to raise the age of criminal responsibility was that they needed to be sure that this wouldn't have a dreadful impact on their white citizens who were being attacked by 10-year-olds, or something to that effect. Anyway, it was a sickening press release from COAG. So, Australia is in breach of its own human rights obligations. It's signed up to human rights conventions, and only the ACT has raised the age of criminal responsibility from 10 years old to 14. None of the others will. And I urge all Australians to continue to campaign on that very matter. Now, actually in Australia, we have still some of the highest imprisonment rates in the world for non-white people. So Aboriginal adults and Aboriginal children are detained in prisons and other forms of detention at some of the highest rates of detention in the world. When I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody after a very long stint at the Central Land Council, Groote Eylandt had the highest recorded imprisonment rate in the world, bar none, at over 2,600 people per 100,000. And still today, the imprisonment rates are high. And moreover, since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which started back in 1987 and finished in 1991, and Senator Dodson was one of the commissioners, the imprisonment rates have increased. Now, and moreover, the imprisonment rates of Indigenous women and Indigenous children have skyrocketed. And in addition, the removal of Aboriginal children from their families has skyrocketed. So I met women in Alice Springs one morning, getting off a bus from Western Australia, had come over to Alice Springs to campaign. Well, not really to campaign, really they were, you know, extraordinary women from very, very poor communities related to John Pat. And they wanted to talk to people about why this was happening, because John Pat wasn't the only case. And so we had some meetings in Alice Springs. I ran into them in the old Italian coffee shop at the bus stop, where the Greyhound buses used to pull up in Alice Springs, and made friends with them and organised some meetings for them. And it went on to become a campaign because of these women who were related to John Pat. They went around the country by bus and set up a national movement, a Black Deaths in Custody movement, and they were successful in getting the Royal Commission set up. And most of them were mothers and, you know, female relatives who wanted to know why these young men were dying in custody, what was happening. So Patrick might, or Senator Dodson might want to have something to say about this, but the first recommendation out of, I think, 336 of the Royal Commission was to use imprisonment as a last resort, and that primary recommendation has been completely ignored since 1991. And I say, people argue with me, especially people in government, but I maintain that most of the recommendations have not been implemented. And if they ever were, the implementation ceased. And we're at the stage now where apparently the major cause of deaths in custody for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is failure to provide medical attention. So we've had people who've died from asthma and, you know, other pre-existing conditions, and they were refused medical attention or denied medical attention. And you know, there are quite a number of very strong recommendations on this matter. None of them have been complied with. None of our jurisdictions provide medical attention and medical assessments of detainees, whether they're in remand or in prison. So, yes, I'm very frustrated. I could go on for hours about this topic. Very frustrated.
And Patrick, might be a good point to bring you into this conversation. What do you think is next for activism, given that if we're asking Australia to change the record, to really have a look at the incarceration rates of our people across Australia, what's next for activism? We've had, you know, it's been 20 years since the Bridge Walk. We've had Black Lives Matter this year. What do you think is next for activism in this country? How do we get change?
Two big issues that we've got on our plate. One is the voice to the Parliament and the constitutional entrenchment of that voice, with whatever limitations there might arise from the legislation that will surround it. The other big issue is the time is really upon us to seriously deal with the question of treaty, because these other matters all become factors in what needs to be considered and how it needs to be improved. And until there's some fundamental agreement by way of a treaty, and I know some states and the territories are looking at this and they're progressing it, slowly, but the national arrangements have not been embarked upon. There's no national treaty movement. And I know there's a truth-telling and a Makarrata idea that's come from Uluru, which let's talk about truth and treaty making. But we otherwise we just deal systemically, and we don't have a Bill of Rights under our Constitution. We rely on litigation at times, or we rely on decent laws to be passed, and laws are not always influenced by our position on them. So there's got to be a acknowledgement of what's happened and why it happened and how we're going to fix it. And that's the hard part, is we've got to turn our minds to what is it we want and how do we want it to be in the treaty arrangement and agreement, and focus on that. And that doesn't mean we don't have to have good legal services and all these services that we have now. But until there's a real political movement from amongst the First Nations aimed at a treaty agreement making process at a national level, or the preparations for that, we'll continue to talk about deaths in custody, children being taken away, etc. We've obviously got to take stock of, no one's going to do this for us. We've got to take stock of it, and we've got to deal with the social issues that are crippling our societies and causing hurt and pain and a whole range of other things, domestic violence. So we've got to take stock of those things. Otherwise, we will not achieve any real political status that goes towards the justice that people want in this nation.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, let's start wrapping up now, and let's look forward into the future of activism. And Bruce, I might get you to respond to this. What do you think modern advocacy or activism looks like? Is it taking to the streets? Is it social media movements? Is it writing books that change the narrative of this country? Or is it all of those? What do you think modern activism looks like?
Social media. It is more books and films, but it's education basically. And I think we need to get to 8 and 9-year-olds as a matter of priority, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal kids, because moral judgments in their minds are very pure. And we need to allow them to form their views of justice and allow them to form their views of history, not to be didactic in any way, because that is the generation who might have the idea of change conceived by their parents, but they will have to deliver it. And there's a huge responsibility on that group of people now, I think, because they will be delivering whatever is Vincent Lingiari's idea of change. So we have to talk to our own people about that in particular. At one stage, our people were the best educated people in the world because so much work was put into young people to learn the culture, to learn the 8 languages that they would need. So education levels in our old communities was really high. And so we want to say to our kids, the only form of education available to you now, apart from the law, is traditional Western school. Don't despise it. Change it. And go to school, but change it. You being at school will change it. You not being at school and mucking around down the creek or on the streets, that's not going to change it. That will just reinforce it. So we have to tell our kids that it is an honourable black practice to learn. And this is the way you're going to learn in the meantime. And don't despise it as a Western form of hypocrisy. Join it, change it, defeat it.
Thanks, Bruce. Marcia, I might come to you about what are your thoughts? What does modern advocacy or activism look like? I saw you give the power salute there. Do you think that social media can ever replace marching in the street, having hundreds of thousands of people marching in the street for change as happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s? What does modern activism look like for you?
Well, that's a very good question. So I think from time to time, as we saw, with the Black Lives Movement protests, and we had, over 20,000 people out on the streets here in Melbourne. From time to time, those mass protests are tremendously important and invaluable in making headway on these matters and achieving understanding amongst, targeted individuals, especially politicians. So there were mass demonstrations across the country early this year, and a lot of media, and many of us got an opportunity to explain issues in more detail. But I don't think it's ever been the case that mass protest has been the only tool in our toolkit. Even back in the 60s, our elders had a wide range of strategies. They lobbied prime ministers, and that lobbying goes right back to the 1930s and 40s. They lobbied politicians. Back in the day, we knew our politicians. We'd go to their offices and have a talk to them, and we knew who the good politicians were, whether in Labor or the Country Party as it existed back then, or the Liberal Party, or independents. We knew who they were, and we knew who we could talk to, and we knew where we were welcome, and we'd go and keep them informed. We'd have a cup of tea with them and say, well, listen, Mr. So-and-so, there's a problem down at the Aboriginal hostel. We really need your help on this. And some were good and some were not. And there were politicians, and I worked closely, for instance, with the late Senator Keefe from Queensland in the 70s and 80s. I volunteered for him. Wonderful senator, a brilliant man. And he taught me quite a few tactics. So let me just tell you a little story. So he'd go to estimates committee on Aboriginal affairs, as it was back then. And he said to me one day, now, when I rub my nose, I want you to come marching down the room with a file, and I don't care what you've got in it. You can have the cricket almanac or the cricket scores in it, but put it in front of me and whisper in my ear and then walk out. So I did that, and that would be his cue to say, to the Estimates Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, well, look, I've got this information here. and there were some doozies, such as, 50,000 baby turtles escaping from the Torres Strait turtle hatchery, and so on. So he was a formidable politician, and there were some wonderful politicians back then, and it really wasn't divided by party allegiances. It came down to decency. And my memory of the decent politicians were, of course, Neville Bonner. He was a very decent person, very committed. He had his own view of the world, but, that's the way of the world. Senator Keefe, Senator Georges, Tom Uren, there were many others. And I knew my way around the old Parliament House, and I would go and lobby, and I would, write documents for them. I presented a major submission to Fred Chaney when he was minister on the Nullarbor problem, when their sacred site was destroyed by the AMAX exploration country. Was it AMAX or Apex? AMAX. Yeah. And I organised demonstrations out the front of old Parliament House. Fred Chaney hated me back in the day. He's okay now. So, what you need to do is actually learn from older people all the strategies that you can use. And I can remember when we first got a Guernsey with a parliamentary committee. And you'll remember, Patrick, Warren Snowden got us an audience with a parliamentary committee. And he made sure that a delegation from the Central and Northern Land Council went to Parliament. This was back in the 80s. And we appeared before a range of party-aligned committees and also parliamentary committees. And, none of us are small people, and we'd all cram into those tiny little rooms, and we'd write documents and appear before these committees. And we really progressed things like the land claims over the stock routes and reserves, the community living areas. We prevented the worst amendments to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory. And so it was during that time that we learned how to use those parliamentary committees. And then there are other strategies that we use. So then, you know, there were the 1988 bicentennial marches. I was left behind in Alice Springs and you all went down on buses. There were the declarations. So the Barunga Statement at the Barunga Festival, where Bob Hawke, the late Bob Hawke, Prime Minister then, and Jerry Hand, who was the Minister, received the Barunga Statement from Galarrwuy, and I believe it was the late Wenton Rabunja. And there were thousands of Aboriginal people ringed around them in ceremonial dress. And it was a very sacred and important moment when the issue of the treaty was, you know, very much, as you pointed out, high on the agenda. And you'll remember that Bob Hawke reneged on his commitments to us, and he cried crocodile tears when he retired and, you know, said he wished he'd done more. Well, they all say that, don't they? In fact, they did nothing. They did nothing at all.
Do you think, Marcia, that in those instances of either marches or of events where we hand over, you know, documents asserting sovereignty and treaty and rights, they're all well and good in terms of normal activism and the activism that we've come to expect. Do you think now that activism in modern days for our people has to be involved in making change, that we have to be in the boardrooms, we have to be in the decision-making positions, because if we're not, the things that we did over the last 10, 20 years are still going to be happening unless we're in those, unless we're at the table?
Absolutely right. And, you know, here's my recommendation after years of advocacy and activism. You have an opportunity to get through a door and advocate for our rights, for the betterment of our situation, and take the opportunity. Don't be sniffy about it because, you know, you're a very trendy yuppie down in the big city and you're only allowed to use a very confined politically correct language. Be adventurous, take every opportunity, use every tool in the toolkit like our old people did. Whatever was available, they used it. And I'm talking about people who, during the course of a campaign, used a telephone for the first time in their lives. So these days we've got social media, we've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in universities where they have a great deal of influence, whether they realise it or not. We have many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander politicians federally and in state and territory jurisdictions. We have thousands of people in the professions. We have superstars across the professions. And, you know, I think we're far too factionalised on very flaky grounds. There are people who want to factionalise our movement because they're in the Green Party or because they think our terminology is wrong and we should only say First Nations. You know, this is all nonsense. As Senator Dodson and Professor Bruce Pascoe have argued, we need to be united. We need to put aside our petty differences. We need to be a movement again because we're losing ground. Now, we might be making advances on treaties and a few other things, but our children are being removed. People are being incarcerated. We're not making any headway with the numbers of Aboriginal people who are in proper housing.
Yeah.
We don't have potable water in many communities. The health gaps are still far too extreme to countenance. There's no room for petty political indulgences The young need to learn from their elders about political strategy. They need to stop being so precious and so indulgent and, you know, do a few of the hard yards and join the movement. If I can do my bit over here, Senator Dodson can do his bit over there, and Professor Pascoe can do his bit over there. But we are of one mind. There must be a better world for us.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good call to action, and I think bringing sort of some conclusion to the conversation. Senator Dodson, what would your call to action be to today's activists or today's advocates for Indigenous issues?
They've got to maximise all the things that Marcia has raised, but they've got to identify where they can strategically engage. It's one thing to sit on your computer and send a message, but it's another thing to actually engage with the people who are making these decisions. And you've got to find how to influence them. For instance, the Human Rights Committee of the Parliament, which is a cross-house committee, it only looks at 8 of the international covenances and declarations when we assess legislation. We still haven't got the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights as the compulsory part of how you review legislation affecting. So someone's got to pick that up and make that a focal point for agitation. We try to do that within the parliamentary structure, but you need the outside influences also. If you want better laws and you want compliance with those sort of standards, and you've got to go and put the effort in with the independents, with the government that runs the country, as well as with the party I belong to stiffen everyone up, to ensure that the nation can get better laws by at least assessing legislation now against that one particular declaration, which the government's signed up to, hasn't domesticated it into law, but it sits there and we should be using it. And that would give us, add to the work that Marcia and others have been doing on the voice whenever that comes to fruition. But it starts to set some standards within the decision-making instrument of the nation, which is the Parliament, the federal Parliament. That's just one thing. There are many other things that we've just got to be more focused and disciplined about, and then you've got to be dedicated and you've got to be prepared for sacrifice. And that's a word that, a lot of young people don't like, because there is a lot of sacrifice that happens when you go to the battlegrounds on behalf of your people.
Yeah, and absolutely. And you think of, the 8 years that it took to get a conclusion to the Wave Hill walk-off. Bruce, I might bring you in for the final comments of tonight. What's your call to action to today's activists or those that advocate for Indigenous issues, and those that might not advocate by taking to social media or marching in the street, but those that might be writing the next books that challenge the history that we've been taught in this country? What's your call to action to them?
If you're non-Aboriginal, make sure you talk to Aboriginal people first before you write your book. I think that's really important. But in the Aboriginal community, we have to stick together, not tear each other down. We currently have an Aboriginal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, or whatever it's called. I think he's incredibly courageous. We need to support and use that minister because he has done some things that I couldn't believe he would do. The chances are that his party will not be in power next election. We have to be working now to make sure that the next minister is also an Aboriginal person, and I support that person as well. But I think our communities have to stick together. Instead of using white tactics to tear each other down, we need to stick together. If we have arguments with each other, have those outside the media, outside social media, and get on with the real fight, which is to change wide institutions in this country.
Thanks, Bruce. And I think all three of you had a similar call to action there of, standing up and be counted, but doing it in a unified way like we did in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And that's our show for tonight. Thank you to our panellists for your insightful responses. And on behalf of Charles Darwin University, thank you for being part of this 20th Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture. Now, this lecture will be available for further viewing on the Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture page on CDU's website. Good night.
As Vice-Chancellor of Charles Darwin University, it has been an honour to host not one but three highly distinguished speakers for this year's Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture. The Black Lives Matter movement, sweeping the world in 2020, reminded us of the importance of public calls to action and gave us an opportunity to reflect on our own iconic social justice movements here in Australia. It allowed us to probe the legacy of advocacy itself, its impact, the way it has changed, and the enduring lessons that we should take forward. The steadfast and resolute actions of the Gurindji under Vincent Lingiari's leadership saw the Wave Hill walk-off morph into a standoff that lasted more than 8 years, highlighting the importance of change advocacy. Their activism shows us just how important it is to stand up for what we believe in. In this lecture, we heard from Professor Pascoe that Indigenous young people must engage with and own their education. They can draw from a long and sustained history of being the best educated peoples in the world, peoples fluent in some 8 or more languages. Senator Dodson reminded us that focus, strategy, determination and vision are essential elements of advocacy today. And Professor Langton was clear in her call for unity above factions and to be adventurous in using all the tools available, especially those we receive from elders past and present. Knowing that universities have long been places and spaces for critical thinking, innovation and advocacy, I am very proud of the fact that Charles Darwin University continues to make a significant contribution to the improvement of Indigenous communities, and that it has supported ongoing dialogue through this series of the Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lectures. A very warm and sincere thank you to our panellists this year.